The way you speak to yourself changes the way your brain rewires itself. It's not just psychology, it's neurobiology. And in just 3 days, you can start to reshape your internal landscape. What if I told you that your internal dialogue, the words you use with yourself, has a direct and measurable impact on your neurochemistry, that it affects your levels of dopamine, adrenaline, and even GABA, the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in your brain? For 3 days, I want you to run an experiment. This is not positive thinking. This is self-directed neuroplasticity. When you deliberately change your inner language, you're tapping into the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, and the insula, areas of the brain responsible for self-awareness, emotional regulation, and motivation. What we say to ourselves, especially under stress, can either spiral us into a fight or flight loop or activate calm, clarity, and focus. For the next 3 days, I want you to do 3 things. Speak to yourself in the second person. Say, you've got this, not I've got this. Studies show that this shifts your brain out of ego-based self-critique and into coaching mode. You become your own guide, not your own critic. Start your morning with identity statements, not goals. Say, you are someone who keeps promises to yourself, not I will go to the gym. Identity is sticky. It wires deeper into your neural circuitry than intention. Catch negative self-talk and label it. Say, that's a thought, not a fact. This activates your prefrontal cortex and gives you distance from rumination. This isn't motivational fluff. It's neuroscience. The brain listens, the body responds. And after 3 days, just 3, you'll begin to feel the shift, less reactivity, more clarity, more energy. You'll start to become the voice you needed to hear. When most people engage in internal dialogue, they default to first-person language. I'm anxious, I can't do this, or I need to be better. While this might feel natural, studies in cognitive neuroscience and sports psychology reveal that this internal narrative style is actually limiting, especially under conditions of stress or high cognitive load. Shifting to second-person self-talk using you instead of I creates a psychological buffer. This shift activates brain circuits associated with perspective taking, specifically within the medial prefrontal cortex and temporoparietal junction. These are regions responsible for distinguishing between self and others, but they also give us the ability to step back and coach ourselves through difficulty. So instead of saying, I can't do this, you say, you can do this. The change might seem subtle, but the effects are profound. When you use you, your brain responds as if the guidance is coming from someone else you trust, like a mentor or coach, which increases compliance and decreases resistance. This shift in perspective has been shown to improve self-regulation, boost emotional control, and enhance problem-solving under pressure. Athletes use it, elite military operators use it, and we now understand the neurobiological reason why it works. Second-person language decreases activity in brain areas associated with self-critical rumination and increases task-oriented focus. From a biochemical standpoint, this can reduce cortisol release and elevate dopaminergic tone, particularly when the self-talk is paired with small wins or progress signals. That means it doesn't just feel more empowering, it literally shifts your brain chemistry toward motivation and confidence. When practiced consistently, this becomes a form of real-time mental training. You're not just thinking differently, you're engaging in a cognitive protocol that rewires how your nervous system responds to challenge. So for the next 3 days, catch those internal moments and coach yourself like someone you care about. You've got this. You've done harder things. You know what matters right now. This isn't just better thinking. This is neuroscience applied. Most people wake up and set goals. I'm going to go to the gym. I'll eat clean today. I need to stop procrastinating. While well-intentioned, goal-based thinking is often fragile. It relies on motivation, which is inherently unstable, and it keeps your brain operating from a future-focused framework. which can increase cognitive friction and anxiety. Now, here's the neuroscience behind a better approach. Identity-based statement. When you say, I am someone who follows through, or you are the kind of person who shows up no matter how you feel, you're not just setting a goal, you're activating neural networks related to self-satisfying and default mode network integration. That means you're teaching your brain who you are, not just what you want to do. This taps into something we call self-referential processing. The brain treats identity as something sacred and non-negotiable. So when a behavior is tied to your identity, not just a temporary desire, your nervous system fights harder to maintain it. This is supported by studies in behavior change psychology and neuroimaging. Identity statements light up midline cortical structures like the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, regions deeply involved in autobiographical memory and meaning. This gives the statement emotional weight and stickiness. When you act from identity, you're not struggling to become something, you're expressing something you already are. That removes internal resistance. And in terms of neuroplasticity, that's crucial. Repetition of behavior tied to identity forms stronger, more stable neural pathways, the kind that actually hold under stress. So instead of saying, I will try to be productive today, say, you are the kind of person who handles hard things and doesn't make excuses. The brain will begin to match behavior to identity automatically. That's what it's built to do. Now, this isn't about tricking yourself. It's about aligning your internal language with the neurobiological machinery of change. Remember, your brain doesn't care what you hope to do. It cares what you believe you are. And that belief, when reinforced consistently, becomes your default operating system. Identity leads, behavior follows. One of the most powerful tools we have for emotional regulation and mental clarity is incredibly simple, but deeply supported by neuroscience. It's the ability to label when you're caught in a loop of negative self-talk. I'm not good enough. I always mess this up. This is going to fail. Your brain is engaging in default mode network activity. This network, which includes the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, becomes highly active when we ruminate, judge ourselves, or worry about the future. But here's the protocol. Instead of believing the thought, you label it. You say to yourself, that's a thought, not a fact. What this does from a neurological standpoint is shift activity from the limbic system, especially the amygdala, associated with fear and emotion, to the prefrontal cortex, which governs logic, regulation, and decision-making. You're literally redirecting blood flow and neural activity away from panic and toward executive function. There's a term for this in cognitive behavioral neuroscience, cognitive diffusion. It's the process of separating yourself from your thoughts rather than fusing with them. When you label a thought as just that, a mental event, your brain no longer reacts to it as if it's an objective threat. And here's the remarkable part. Neuroimaging studies show that people who practice this form of labeling, even just a few times a day, show increased activation in the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and decreased activity in the amygdala. That means more calm, more control, and less stress. So when that voice shows up, the inner critic, the catastrophizer, the imposter syndrome, you interrupt the loop. You don't argue with it. You don't try to suppress it. You just say, that's a thought, not a fact. That 1 second pause creates just enough space for awareness, and that awareness is the seed of all behavioral change. Over time, with repetition, this simple act of labeling becomes neuroprotective. You condition your brain to stop treating every negative thought like a call to action or a crisis. You restore regulation, you reduce cortisol, you build resilience. This isn't about ignoring reality. It's about mastering the way your nervous system responds to perceived threat. And that starts with realizing not everything you think is true. Label the thought, reclaim the mind. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change its structure and function, is not something that happens passively. It's not automatic. And it's not always beneficial. It's experience dependent, meaning that what you repeatedly think, feel, say, and do literally reshapes your neural circuitry. This is foundational. Every time you engage in a behavior, every time you speak to yourself a certain way, you're sculpting your brain. Neurons that fire together wire together. That's the core of Hebbian plasticity. But what most people forget is that neurons also prune when they're unused. So you're either reinforcing or weakening pathways all the time. Now, when it comes to internal dialogue, the words you use with yourself, this is one of the fastest and most consistent inputs your brain receives. That means your self-talk is one of the primary drivers of your neuroplastic change. When you tell yourself, I always screw this up, or I'm not disciplined, and you repeat that narrative, the brain doesn't debate you. It rewires to support that version of reality. It creates and strengthens circuits that recognize that as truth, and that becomes your perceptual filter. But here's the upside. You can reverse it. You can reshape those circuits by deliberately introducing adaptive, empowering language over and over again. This is why the way you speak to yourself, even if it feels fake at first, matters. Because plasticity isn't about what feels true right now. It's about what gets repeated. The more a pathway is used, the more myelination occurs along that axon, making the signal stronger, faster, more automatic. That's not philosophy. That's neuroscience. And here's something else to know. Neuroplasticity is gated by two things: attention and emotion. That means when you're fully focused and emotionally engaged in what you're saying to yourself, even just for a few seconds, the impact on your brain is significantly amplified. So if you want to change, not just think about changing, you need to understand this principle. Your brain becomes what you do most often with the most focus. You are not rewiring your brain by thinking once. You're rewiring it through repetition with intensity. Neuroplasticity doesn't care if your self-talk is positive or negative. It only cares if it's consistent and emotionally salient. So every time you speak to yourself with clarity, discipline, or courage, you're not just changing your mindset, you're training your biology to align with your best self. The work is daily. The change is cumulative. The brain listens. Key point 5, internal language alters neurochemistry. The way you talk to yourself is not just a mindset. It's a chemical event. Every internal phrase you repeat, especially under stress, triggers a neurochemical cascade in your brain and body. This isn't just about thinking positively or using affirmations. This is about how language modulates neurotransmitter release, shifting your entire internal environment. Let's break this down. When you speak to yourself in ways that are encouraging, focused, and action-oriented, for example, you've done this before, or you're built for this, your brain interprets that not just as information, but as signal. It leads to increases in dopamine, the neuromodulator of motivation and forward movement. Dopamine doesn't just make you feel good, it creates momentum. It strengthens the neural circuits associated with progress, motivation, and reward. It enhances focus and primes your brain to seek challenge and overcome it. This is critical when you're trying to reframe your identity or sustain effort through something hard. But there's more. Internal language also influences levels of adrenaline and norepinephrine, chemicals involved in alertness, arousal, and attention. When your self-talk is panic-inducing or overly critical, things like, I can't handle this, or this always goes wrong, your system gets flooded with stress chemistry. That means elevated sympathetic nervous system activity, tighter muscles, shallower breathing, and compromised decision-making. In contrast, calming, self-coaching language like, you're safe, stay with it, or you're in control here, has been shown to increase GABA, your brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. GABA acts like a brake system, reducing overactivity in the fear centers of the brain, particularly the amygdala. And here's the beautiful part. You can actually feel the shift in real time when your internal language changes. Breath slows. Muscles release, cognition sharpens. That's not placebo, it's state change triggered by language-driven modulation of brain chemistry. Now, none of this is theoretical. fMRI and PET scan studies have shown that different forms of internal dialogue, particularly self-compassionate versus self-critical, activate very different neural circuits and neurochemical pathways. So when you upgrade your inner language, you're not just talking to yourself differently, you're regulating your entire neurobiological system. You're changing the ingredients your brain uses to predict, perceive, and respond to the world. This is why what you say and how you say it to yourself becomes one of the most important levers for shifting out of stress and into a high-deforming adaptive state. Internal language is neurochemical leverage. Use it wisely. One of the biggest misunderstandings around self-talk is the idea that it just needs to be positive to be effective. But in reality, vague affirmations like everything's going to be fine or I'm amazing often have minimal or even counterproductive impact on the brain. Why? Because the brain is a prediction machine. It wants precision. When the language you use internally is too abstract or disconnected from your actual experience, the brain flags it as incongruent, and it doesn't activate the neural systems responsible for real change. So here's the rule. Precision beats positivity. If your self-talk is going to create neurobiological change, it must be anchored in context and specificity. That means instead of saying, "You're great," say, "You've prepared for this. You've executed this exact process before under pressure." That small shift moves your self-talk from empty affirmation into evidence-based reinforcement. And that has a very different effect on the nervous system. Why does this matter? Because precise self-talk recruits more activity in the prefrontal cortex, which governs planning, reasoning, and adaptive behavior. It also creates a feedback loop that reinforces behaviorally aligned identity. You're not trying to convince yourself of something. You're reminding your system of what's already true. This leads to greater neural efficiency and emotional coherence. Vague affirmations, by contrast, tend to engage less neural specificity and, if repeated without alignment to real behavior, can actually increase cognitive dissonance. In other words, your brain subtly resists the statement because it can't find real-world evidence to support it. And that resistance shows up as discomfort or internal friction. Think of your internal dialogue like a targeting system for behavior and emotion. The more specific and timely your language is, the better it guides your system toward adaptive outcomes. So don't just say, "I'll do better." Say, "You're the kind of person who stays calm during feedback. You know exactly what to adjust, and you're already doing it." This form of language activates dopaminergic and goal-relevant networks because it references actual process, behavior, and identity, not just outcome. Bottom line, positivity isn't the goal, precision is. And when you practice using precise, situationally relevant self-talk, you're not just giving yourself a motivational boost, you're coding your brain for resilience, consistency, and performance. There's a misconception that change in the brain takes months or years to begin, but that's not entirely accurate. While long-term change does require consistency, the first signs of neuroplastic adaptation begin in hours to days, not weeks. In fact, research shows that 3 consecutive days of deliberate, focused internal practice, especially self-directed self-talk, can begin to trigger what's called a plasticity cascade. This is the early stage process where synaptic connections begin to strengthen, new neural pathways are initiated, and old patterns begin to weaken. Let's break this down. Your brain is constantly evaluating which circuits to reinforce. It does this based on frequency, intensity, and relevance of input. So if over the course of 3 days you consistently engage in intentional, emotionally salient self-talk, your brain starts to shift its wiring to support that internal narrative. This happens in phases. Immediate early genes like CFOS are activated within neurons, which are indicators that new learning or emotional salience has occurred. These are turned on within minutes to hours of repeated exposure to novel stimuli, like speaking to yourself in a new, adaptive way. If the input continues, especially with emotion attached, the brain begins to produce neurotrophins like BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which helps solidify these new pathways. BDNF essentially acts as fertilizer for neurons, making it easier to form lasting synaptic changes. After about 72 hours of consistent, emotionally engaged practice, the brain begins to transition from short-term plasticity, temporary signal changes, to structural plasticity, the beginnings of actual changes in neural wiring. This is why 3 days matters. It's not random. It's a neurobiological threshold, a signal to the brain that this new behavior or pattern of thought might be worth keeping. Now, is it permanent after 3 days? No. The real consolidation takes longer with continued repetition, but this initial window is powerful because it opens the door. You begin to feel the shift, less internal resistance, more clarity, more ability to catch and redirect negative thought loops in real time. It's also important to note, these first 3 days are when most people quit, not because the method isn't working, but because their brain is still transitioning out of the old circuitry. That's the critical moment where you must persist. When you deliberately speak to yourself with focus and self-directed intent for 3 consecutive days, and pair that with behaviors aligned to those statements, you're essentially sending a message to your nervous system. This matters now. Reinforce this, make this the new baseline. You are the architect. And in just 72 hours, you begin laying down the blueprint. One of the most overlooked aspects of internal dialogue or self-talk is its direct influence on the autonomic nervous system, ASNs. This is the part of your nervous system that regulates automatic processes like heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, digestion, and the stress response. In simpler terms, how you speak to yourself influences how your body feels and performs. Now, the autonomic nervous system has 2 primary branches. The sympathetic branch, which drives alertness, readiness, and stress, often referred to as fight or flight. The parasympathetic branch, which governs calm, recovery, and restoration, known as rest and digest. Your internal language can push you into either state depending on its tone, precision, and emotional content. For example, when your self-talk is anxious, self-critical, or defeatist, I can't handle this, everything's going to go wrong, it amplifies sympathetic tone. That means increased heart rate, shallower breathing, elevated cortisol, and reduced ability to think clearly. The brain interprets that inner voice as a threat cue and prepares the body accordingly. But when you shift to intentional, self-coaching language, even something as simple as "You're okay, stay grounded, you know what to do next," you activate circuits in the prefrontal cortex and insula, which are known to downregulate limbic reactivity and engage parasympathetic tone. This brings about real physiological changes. Heart rate begins to stabilize. Breathing deepens. Blood flow returns to the frontal cortex, improving executive function. Muscle tension decreases. Cortisol levels begin to normalize. In other words, your internal language becomes a lever for state control, giving you the ability to shift from reactivity to responsiveness, from chaos to clarity. And here's what's especially powerful. This control is trainable. When you consistently pair self-directed language with physiological awareness like breath regulation or posture, you're creating a feedback loop that links cognition with autonomic control. Over time, this loop becomes more efficient and more automatic. You're no longer just reacting to the world, you're regulating yourself from within. This is why elite performers from special forces to Olympic athletes train their inner dialogue with precision. It's not about motivation, it's about autonomic command. Because the truth is, your biology responds more to the signals you send yourself than the circumstances you're in. And when your internal language becomes intentional, grounded, and strategic, you gain access to the full spectrum of your performance, cognitively, emotionally, and physiologically. You are your own operator, and self-directed language is one of the most accessible, science-backed tools to take control of your nervous system and bring yourself back into alignment on demand. What you say to yourself is not just background noise, it's a neural command, a biological signal that your entire system listens to. If for 3 days, just 3, you commit to speaking to yourself with precision, identity, and deliberate self-leadership, you'll begin to change not just how you feel, but what your brain becomes capable of. The nervous system doesn't care what you hope to become. It responds to what you repeat with intensity. And in a world that's constantly trying to program you from the outside, your internal language is the most powerful form of neurological sovereignty you have. So the question is not, can you change? The question is, can you become the kind of person who speaks truth into your own biology before the world tells you what's possible? Talk to yourself like it matters, because it does. Your brain is listening, and it's ready to build the version of you that you decide to speak into existence.